Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey, not to the gleaming castles or the chivalrous tournaments of medieval lore, but deep into the murky, often terrifying, heart of its legal system. Imagine this: you're a common peasant, or perhaps a struggling merchant, living in a small mud and timber village somewhere in 13th century Europe. A dispute has arisen, perhaps a stolen pig, a boundary dispute with a neighbor, or worse, an accusation of a more serious crime. There are no police lights flashing, no smooth-talking lawyers, no pristine courthouses. Instead, justice is a shadowy, often arbitrary force, dictated by powerful men, ancient customs, and sometimes even by divine intervention. You probably won't survive this system with your dignity intact, or perhaps even your life. But we're going to dive into why justice really sucked in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world utterly unlike your own, a world where law is not a universal, codified set of rules, but a patchwork quilt of local customs, feudal obligations, and the sometimes whimsical will of your immediate lord. The very concept of justice is fluid, shifting from one manner to the next, from one feudal domain to another. There's no central government enforcing a uniform legal code across vast territories. Instead, every village, every town, every noble's estate might have its own particular way of resolving disputes and punishing transgressions. Your life is largely dictated by tradition and the local power structure. If a wrong has been committed, your first recourse is likely to be your village elders, or perhaps the local reeve, a sort of village manager. But for anything more serious, or if the initial mediation fails, you're looking at the Lord's Court, a place where true justice can feel like a distant dream, replaced by arbitrary power and often brutal outcomes. One mainstream historical fact that immediately complicates any modern understanding of medieval law is that the medieval justice system was highly decentralized, fragmented, and largely based on customary law, local feudal authority, and ecclesiastical church courts, rather than a unified national legal code, making justice often inconsistent, deeply influenced by social status, and highly localized. There was no single justice system across all of medieval Europe, but a myriad of overlapping and often conflicting jurisdictions. Think of it as hundreds of tiny localized legal systems, each with its own quirks and biases. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the casual brutality and local nature of justice is the common sight of local punishment devices prominently displayed in market squares or near castle gates. These weren't just gallows for executions, but often stocks and pillories, or even ducking stools, used for public shaming and minor punishments. Imagine walking through your town square and seeing someone's head and hands locked in a wooden frame for public mockery, or a scolding woman being dunked in a pond. And that's just for minor offenses. Historians still argue whether the prominent and public nature of medieval punishments was primarily designed to deter crime through fear and public humiliation, serving as a highly visible warning to illiterate populations, or if it also satisfied a societal desire for spectacle and retribution, providing a form of entertainment in an era with limited distractions. Was it about deterring crime, or entertaining the masses, that made justice so public? As you navigate this system, You quickly realize that your social standing is paramount. If you're a serf, tied to the land, your rights are minimal, and your fate is largely in the hands of your lord. If you're a freeman, you might have slightly more recourse, but still limited power against the entrenched authority. And if you're a noble, the rules might bend considerably in your favor. Or conversely, your crimes might be met with an even harsher, more symbolic punishment due to your higher status. There's no equality before the law as you know it. Justice wears a different face for every social class. The legal proceedings themselves are far from the orderly, evidence-based trials you're accustomed to. They might take place outdoors, in a muddy field, or in the cramped, smoky hall of a castle. There are no professional lawyers to represent you, no forensic evidence, and often, no concept of innocent until proven guilty. Instead, your fate might rest on an oath, a duel, or even a bizarre, terrifying test of divine judgment. You feel the constant unease, the low hum of anxiety, knowing that a simple accusation or a misinterpreted act could plunge you into this terrifying legal labyrinth. The sun might be shining, and the birds might be singing, but the shadow of medieval justice, arbitrary and brutal, looms large over every aspect of your life, and you're about to discover just how profoundly it sucked. Having been introduced to the chaotic, fragmented world of medieval law, your first direct encounter with its unpleasant realities will almost certainly be at the hands of feudal lords local. Arbitrary. Forget the distant, imposing figure of a king or a centralized legal system. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, justice was a deeply personal affair, administered directly by the local lord whose lands you lived on, and whose word was, quite literally, law. You quickly learned that your fate, your rights, and your very life are utterly dependent on the whims, biases, and sometimes terrifying capriciousness of the man who holds power over your village. It's like living in a small town where the mayor is also the judge, the police chief, and the executioner, and he can change the rules based on how he feels that day. You find yourself summoned to the lord's manor or castle, perhaps to a smoky great hall, where justice is dispensed. The air is thick with the smell of stale rushes, wood smoke, and the lingering scent of previous meals. The lord sits, perhaps on a raised dais, surrounded by his knights, household retainers, and the occasional clerk. He is not a trained legal professional as you know it. He is a warrior, a landowner, and his authority stems from his power, his lineage, and his ability to enforce his will. His understanding of law is a blend of inherited custom, personal experience, and what he deems expedient for maintaining order on his estate. One mainstream historical fact that completely redefines the concept of legal fairness in this era is that in medieval feudalism, local lords held significant judicial power over their tenants and serfs. Administering justice directly in manorial courts based on local customs and their own discretion, often with little oversight from higher authorities. This meant that justice was profoundly localized, inconsistent, and highly vulnerable to the individual prejudices or moods of the lord. Think about that. Your entire legal future depends on whether your lord had a good breakfast or a bad temper that morning. Imagine presenting your case. You speak in hushed tones, perhaps kneeling, your eyes fixed on the lord's face, trying to gauge his mood. There are no formal lawyers to present your argument, no complex legal precedents you can cite. Your best hope is to speak clearly, honestly, and to gain the lord's sympathy or a sense of his favor. Your social standing and your relationship with the lord or his immediate family could dramatically influence the outcome. If you were a favored craftsman, your case might be heard with more leniency than if you were a troublesome serf who often argued about his feudal duties. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Lord's arbitrary power is the medieval concept of amercement. This was a fine imposed at the Lord's discretion for various minor offenses, often with no fixed amount. The Lord could impose a higher or lower fine based on his personal judgment of the offense or the individual. Imagine being fined for jaywalking, and the judge just picks a random amount of money out of his head based on whether he likes your hat. That day, historians still argue whether the arbitrary nature of feudal justice, despite its obvious flaws, inadvertently fostered stronger community cohesion and informal dispute resolution within villages as people tried to avoid the Lord's court, or if it primarily served as a tool of oppression, maintaining the social hierarchy and exploiting the lower classes through unpredictable punishments and fines. Did it build community, or just create fear? The punishments dispensed by the Lord could be swift and brutal, often without appeal. For minor offenses, it might be a fine remember that weregild concept, which could apply here too, but often just went to the Lord, or public humiliation in the stocks or pillory as we discussed in the intro. For more serious crimes, it could be flogging, mutilation, or even execution, all administered directly or by the Lord's appointed bailiff or executioner. Remember that miserable fellow, his job was tied to these lords. The Lord's word was final, and defiance could be met with overwhelming force from his armed retainers. The very concept of what constituted a crime could also feel arbitrary. Disputes over property lines, stolen livestock, poaching in the Lord's forest, or even speaking ill of the Lord or his family could be brought before him. The evidence might be flimsy, based on rumors or personal testimony, and the Lord's decision often relied on his own intuition, biases, or simple convenience for managing his domain. You feel the cold sweat on your brow as the Lord fixes you with his gaze. You try to speak, your voice trembling, acutely aware that your entire future, and perhaps that of your family, hangs precariously on the mood of this single, powerful man. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the pervasive, arbitrary power of feudal lords. Your legal fate was often determined by the personal whims of your local ruler, turning every transgression into a terrifying gamble, where true fairness was a luxury rarely afforded to the common person. And the long shadow of his personal judgment fell heavy over every aspect of your life. When the evidence was scarce, the testimony conflicted, or the local lord simply couldn't decide. Medieval justice often turned to a terrifying and seemingly inexplicable arbiter trial by ordeal divine gamble. Forget logical arguments, witness cross-examination, or forensic evidence. In this era, proving innocence or guilt for serious crimes often involved submitting to a physical test, where the outcome was believed to be dictated not by human reason, but by the direct intervention of God. You quickly learn that your fate might hinge not on facts, but on whether your skin heals cleanly or if you can hold your breath long enough, turning your trial into a desperate, agonizing gamble with the divine. It's like playing a game of Russian roulette, but with God pulling the trigger, and your life is the only bullet. You stand accused of a serious crime, perhaps theft, adultery, or even murder, a crime for which there are no clear witnesses or definitive proof. The Lord, or the presiding cleric, pronounces the decision you must undergo an ordeal. A chilling wave of fear washes over you, knowing that this is not a test of strength or cunning, but a direct appeal to supernatural judgment, and the odds are stacked terrifyingly against you. The air around the ordeal site, whether it's a church, a riverbank, or a blacksmith's forge, is thick with a heavy, solemn tension, broken only by murmured prayers and the anxious breaths of onlookers. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the arbitrary nature of medieval justice is that trial by ordeal, particularly by hot iron, hot water, or cold water, was a widely practiced method for determining guilt or innocence for serious crimes in medieval Europe, based on the belief that God would miraculously intervene to protect the innocent and condemn the guilty. These judicial ordeals were often overseen by clergy and were considered a final, unappealable judgment in the absence of clear evidence. Think about it. Your innocence is decided by whether boiling water scalds you or not. Imagine the preparation for an ordeal by hot iron. A piece of iron, perhaps a plowshare or a simple bar, is heated to a glowing red over a roaring fire, often within the consecrated ground of a church. Priests would perform rituals and prayers, blessing the iron, imbuing it with divine judgment. You're made to walk a set number of paces, often 9, holding this searing hot iron in your bare hand, or sometimes even walk barefoot over several pieces of glowing iron. Your skin immediately sizzles. The smell of burning flesh fills your nostrils, and excruciating pain shoots up your arm. Your hand is then immediately bandaged and sealed, often by the priest. 3 days later, the bandages are removed. If the wound is clean and healing, you are declared innocent. If it is festering, infected, or not healing, you're deemed guilty. The psychological pressure, the sheer agony of the burn, and the knowledge that your future hinges on the natural process of wound infection, all combine into a terrifying ordeal. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the perverse logic and occasional loophole of these ordeals is that while the test itself was designed to be agonizing, some historical accounts suggest that those administering the ordeal might subtly influence the outcome. A sympathetic priest might use a slightly cooler iron or bandage the wound with poultices that aided healing, while a hostile one might heat the iron hotter or use bandages that promoted infection. Imagine your life depending not just on God, but on the subjective sympathy of the guy holding the hot poker. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of judicial ordeals were truly random, leaving everything to divine intervention, or if human factors like the influence of the clergy, the physical resilience of the accused, or even subtle forms of cheating by either side often played a more significant, albeit unacknowledged, role in determining the verdict, making them less of a direct divine judgment and more of a brutal, often manipulated, test of endurance. Did God decide? Or did earthly bias subtly nudge the outcome? Then there's the ordeal by hot water. Your arm or hand is plunged into a cauldron of boiling water, and you must retrieve a specific object, perhaps a ring or a stone. The scalding pain is immediate and profound, blistering your skin. Similar to the hot iron, the wound's healing after 3 days would determine your innocence or guilt. For accusations of a less severe nature, or for lower classes, there was the ordeal by cold water. You, bound with ropes, would be thrown into a consecrated body of water, a lake, a pond, or a river. If you sank, you were deemed innocent as the pure water accepted you. If you floated, you were guilty as the water rejected you. The perverse logic of this test, where innocence often meant drowning, made it a truly terrifying form of judgment, especially if the person couldn't swim. You feel the cold dread of the water, or the searing heat of the fire, knowing that your life, your honor, and your very soul are on trial. You pray, you plead, but ultimately, your fate rests on a theological gamble, a brutal test of faith and flesh. The onlookers watch in solemn silence, believing they are witnessing God's direct judgment, an unassailable truth revealed through suffering. The recovery from an ordeal, even if you were found innocent, was a traumatic process. Severe burns, infections, and psychological scarring would be a constant reminder of the day your fate was decided by divine intervention. Many would die from the injuries even after being declared innocent. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable nature of trial by ordeal. Your very survival hinged on a crude physical test interpreted by religious dogma, making innocence a matter of divine favor and brute endurance, rather than any logical proof, a grim testament to a legal system that often preferred a terrifying gamble to rigorous inquiry. When divine intervention through ordeal failed to convince, or when the honor of a noble was at stake, medieval justice had another terrifying, deeply personal, and often fatal recourse. Trial by combat might makes right. Forget courtroom dramas and eloquent arguments. Here, truth was literally decided by the swing of a sword or the thrust of a lance, with God ostensibly granting victory to the righteous party. You quickly learn that your ability to prove your innocence or your claim might hinge entirely on your skill with a weapon, your physical strength, and your sheer willingness to risk life and limb, turning a legal dispute into a brutal, bloody duel. It's like settling a legal argument with a boxing match, but with actual swords and no time limit, and the loser potentially dies. You stand at the edge of a designated combat arena, perhaps a cleared field within a castle bailey, or a specific lists ground. The air is tense, hushed by the solemnity of the occasion. Before you, two individuals, the accuser and the accused, prepare for battle. They might be knights in full armor, or lesser men armed with more basic weapons, depending on their social status and the nature of the dispute. This isn't a mere brawl, it's a formalized legal proceeding, a sanctioned duel where God's judgment is believed to manifest through the outcome of the fight. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the concept of evidence in medieval law is that trial by combat was a legally recognized and widely practiced method of dispute resolution in medieval Europe, particularly for serious accusations like treason, murder, or honor disputes, where the outcome of a duel between the accuser and accused or their champions was believed to reveal God's judgment and definitively establish guilt or innocence. This method was favored by nobles and knights, who saw it as an honorable way to prove a point. Imagine the preparations. Each combatant would swear an oath before God that their cause was just. Priests might bless their weapons, further imbuing the combat with divine significance. The weapons used would be appropriate to their status. A knight would use sword, shield, and perhaps a lance from horseback. A commoner might fight on foot with a club, axe, or simple sword. The combatants might wear armor, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, adding to the spectacle and the brutality. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the pragmatic and sometimes strange application of trial by combat is the allowance for champions. If a party was physically incapable of fighting, a woman, an elderly person, a child, or someone with a disability, they could hire a champion to fight on their behalf. Imagine hiring a professional fighter to resolve your property dispute, his victory legally proving your claim. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of trial by combat, despite its obvious dangers and potential for injustice as physical prowess, didn't necessarily equate to moral righteousness. primarily served as a means to prevent endless blood feuds by offering a definitive, if violent, resolution, or if it was simply a reflection of a warrior culture that valued martial skill and honor above all else, making it a culturally ingrained, rather than purely rational, legal mechanism. Did it prevent chaos, or just glorify violence? The fight itself is a brutal, visceral affair. You hear the clang of steel on steel, the heavy thud of blows, the grunts of exertion, and the strained breathing of the combatants. It's a dance of death, precise yet savage, where skill, strength, endurance, and sheer luck combine to determine the outcome. There are few rules beyond not fleeing or using forbidden trickery. The duel continues until one party is defeated, either by death, severe injury, or by conceding defeat. If one combatant dies, their guilt or innocence is definitively proven by God's judgment. If one yields, they are considered guilty, often facing the original punishment for the crime they were accused of, or a lesser penalty for having been defeated. The defeated champion, even if he survived, might face severe social disgrace or further punishment. The psychological pressure on the combatants is immense. Not only are they fighting for their lives, but for their honor, their reputation, and the legal outcome of a dispute. The crowd watches in hushed silence, believing they are witnessing divine will unfold before their very eyes, an unassailable judgment from God. The air is thick with tension, bloodlust, and the solemnity of a judicial rite. You feel your own heart pound, caught between the brutal reality of the violence and the medieval belief in its divine purpose. You watch as a man falls, his body slumping to the ground, and you realize that in this chilling legal system, the ultimate arbiter of truth isn't reason or evidence, but the sharp edge of a blade and the raw force of human combat. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable nature of trial by combat. Your innocence might be decided not by your honesty, but by your ability to wield a weapon, turning every legal dispute into a potential duel to the death, where might truly made right in the eyes of God and man. Having witnessed the raw, brutal judgments of ordeal and combat, you might wonder what specific rules even governed these medieval trials. The unsettling truth is that the legal system, unwritten, confused, was less a coherent code and more a chaotic, often contradictory, patchwork of local customs, ancient traditions, and evolving royal or ecclesiastical decrees. Forget thick legal tomes and clearly defined statutes. In the Middle Ages, law was a fluid, decentralized, and often deeply confusing entity, making it incredibly difficult for anyone, especially the common person, to understand their rights, obligations, or potential penalties. You quickly learn that navigating this legal labyrinth requires less knowledge of codified rules and more an intuitive grasp of local quirks and the whims of power. It's like trying to play a game where half the rules are unwritten, the other half are contradictory, and the referee makes up new ones as he goes along. You find yourself in a local court, perhaps a manorial court presided over by the Lord's bailiff, or a village moot where elders gather. The atmosphere is informal, noisy, and sometimes intimidating. There's no single book of laws, no definitive legal precedent that applies everywhere. Instead, the decisions are based on what has always been done in this particular place, tempered by what the local authority deems appropriate. One mainstream historical fact that completely redefines our modern understanding of legal clarity is that medieval legal systems, particularly in the early and high Middle Ages, were predominantly based on customary law, largely unwritten, orally transmitted, and varied significantly from region to region, leading to a fragmented and often inconsistent application of justice. This lack of universal codified law made legal understanding difficult and outcomes unpredictable. Imagine being accused of a crime or trying to settle a dispute when the law is literally held in the memories of a few local elders or the Lord's retainers. There's no way to look up your rights, no clear definition of what constitutes a specific offense. You rely on what you've heard, what your parents taught you, and what the local custom dictates. This makes understanding your legal standing incredibly precarious. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the oral nature of much medieval law is the reliance on doomsmen, or law speakers. In some early Germanic and Norse traditions, remember those from the Viking Age. They persisted in some forms. These individuals were responsible for memorizing and reciting the customary laws, essentially acting as living law books. Imagine a society where the entire legal code is stored in one person's head, prone to forgetfulness, selective memory, or even deliberate omission. Historians still argue whether the unwritten, customary nature of medieval law fostered a more flexible and adaptable legal system, allowing it to evolve organically with societal changes and local needs, or if it primarily led to increased arbitrariness, corruption, and a lack of transparency, making it harder for common people to gain genuine justice against powerful individuals. Did it promote adaptability or injustice? The legal landscape was also a confusing mix of overlapping jurisdictions. You might commit an offense that falls under the Lord's manorial court, but if it has a religious element like blasphemy or adultery, it could also fall under the Church's ecclesiastical courts. We'll get to those later. If you were a merchant, your case might be subject to the special laws of a merchant guild or a town charter. This meant that the same act could be judged by different authorities, with different rules and different outcomes, creating a bewildering legal maze. The very language of the law was also a barrier. While Latin was used for formal records by literate clerks, much of the oral legal proceedings would be in various local vernaculars, often with regional dialects. Even if a local custom was well established, its precise interpretation could be debated, and there was no definitive authority to provide a clear ruling. The evolution of law was slow and piecemeal. Kings and powerful lords would issue charters or statutes, slowly building up a body of written law. But these rarely superseded all local customs, and their enforcement could be spotty. The rise of common law in England, for instance, was a gradual process of royal courts establishing precedents that eventually became more universal. But this took centuries. For much of the Middle Ages, you were living in a legal twilight zone. You feel the frustration of trying to understand what is permitted and what is forbidden, what is custom and what is arbitrary. You try to recall the local sayings, the anecdotes of past judgments, piecing together a fragile understanding of the rules that govern your life. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the profound confusion of its legal system. Your legal fate was constantly uncertain, dictated by a chaotic mix of unwritten customs, conflicting jurisdictions, and the shifting whims of local power, ensuring that for the common person, genuine understanding of the law was a rare luxury, and justice was a bewildering, often impossible, pursuit. As if the bewildering, unwritten laws of feudal lords weren't enough, another powerful, pervasive, and often deeply influential authority loomed large over medieval society, often administering its own distinct form of justice: clergy's court's moral authority. Forget the clear separation of church and state. In the Middle Ages, the Church wielded immense temporal as well as spiritual power, establishing its own parallel legal system that judged not just religious offenses, but also many aspects of daily life, often with a unique blend of moral righteousness and brutal punishment. You quickly learn that your soul, your reputation, and even your body could be subject to the judgment of a different kind of court, one that claimed divine sanction for its rulings. It's like living in a country where every citizen is subject to both government law and a parallel, equally powerful, religious law, and their jurisdictions often overlap in confusing ways. You might find yourself summoned before a bishop's court or a local archdeacon's tribunal, typically held in a cathedral chapter house or a parish church. The atmosphere is different from the Lord's smoky hall. Here, there's a greater emphasis on formality, on written records often in Latin, and on the solemnity of religious ritual. The judges are clerics, bishops, abbots, or priests, whose authority stems from canon law, the law of the Church, and their interpretation of divine will. Their concern is not just with earthly order, but with the moral and spiritual health of the community. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this dual legal system is that the medieval Church operated a vast and influential ecclesiastical court system, or canon law courts, which held jurisdiction over religious matters: heresy, blasphemy, moral offenses, adultery, usury, clerical disputes, and even some civil matters: marriage. Wills, often providing a more centralized and theoretically consistent legal framework than fragmented feudal courts. These courts applied canon law, a distinct legal tradition that paralleled, and often competed with, secular law. Think about it: a different court for your sins, with its own rules and punishments. Imagine being accused of a moral transgression, perhaps adultery, slander, or a failure to observe religious feast days. You are brought before the cleric, who sits in judgment, often with a stern expression. Evidence might be gathered through witness testimony, but there's also a strong emphasis on confession and the spiritual state of the accused. The aim is often to bring the sinner to repentance, to correct moral failings, and to ensure the salvation of their soul. A particularly quirky tidbit about ecclesiastical courts is their surprising jurisdiction over certain seemingly mundane matters, like disputes over broken promises or small debts if a solemn oath had been involved. This meant that the Church could, in effect, mediate disputes that today would be purely secular, simply by virtue of the moral weight attached to oaths. Imagine going to a priest to resolve a debt dispute because someone broke a promise they made before God. Historians still argue whether the Church's extensive legal reach, by often offering a more standardized system and a pathway for appeal across wider territories, especially compared to fragmented local feudal courts, provided a more accessible or fairer form of justice for some common people, or if its ultimate focus on moral and spiritual control, coupled with severe spiritual penalties, made it equally, if not more, oppressive in its own way. Did it offer more justice or more control than the feudal lords? The punishments dispensed by the church courts were often different from secular penalties, focusing on penance, spiritual correction, and public shame. For minor offenses, it might be fasting, pilgrimage, or public confession. For more serious moral transgressions, it could involve excommunication, being cut off from the church, a terrifying spiritual punishment, public humiliation like wearing a penitential garment, or fines. However, for grave offenses, especially heresy, the church could be extremely brutal. While the church itself rarely directly inflicted capital punishment, it could hand over condemned heretics to the secular authorities for execution, often by burning at the stake, ensuring their bodies were purified by fire and their souls, hopefully, saved through their suffering. This chilling collaboration between spiritual and temporal power meant that the Church's moral authority could lead to agonizing physical ends. You recall the grim purpose of the executioner from earlier. His axe and the stake could serve the Church's will as much as the Lord's. You feel the weight of spiritual judgment, the constant anxiety of your immortal soul being on trial. You listen to the solemn pronouncements, the Latin phrases you may not fully understand, but whose intent is chillingly clear. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about the arbitrary whims of feudal lords. It's about the pervasive, often competing, authority of clergy's courts. Your life was subject to a dual legal system, one focused on earthly order, the other on eternal salvation, both capable of inflicting immense suffering, ensuring that your every action was judged, not just by man, but by the divine, with a pervasive moral authority that permeated every corner of your miserable existence. Even within the confusing maze of feudal and ecclesiastical courts, another stark reality quickly becomes apparent, fundamentally undermining any notion of universal fairness Vergilden finds wealthy justice. Forget the principle of equality before the law. In the Middle Ages, money, and particularly the ability to pay, often served as a powerful shield, allowing the rich to escape the harsher physical penalties that were the grim reality for the poor. You quickly learn that your social status and the size of your purse could literally determine whether you walked free with a fine or faced the gallows or the torturer's rack. It's like playing a game where the rules are different for those who can afford to buy their way out of trouble. You witness a trial in the Lord's court, or perhaps hear a judgment from a church official, a wealthy merchant accused of a serious offense, perhaps causing grievous bodily harm in a brawl, or even accidental manslaughter, faces his accuser. Instead of a public flogging or a trial by ordeal, remember those terrifying gambles. From Section 3, the discussion quickly turns to compensation. His family, his connections, and most importantly, his wealth, allow him a different path to justice. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this class-based application of justice is that the medieval legal system often allowed wealthy individuals to pay fines weregild for serious crimes like murder, or other financial penalties to compensate victims or the authorities, thereby avoiding corporal punishment, mutilation, or execution, a privilege largely inaccessible to the poor who faced much harsher physical retribution for similar offenses. This economic disparity was a fundamental characteristic of medieval justice, where money could literally buy your freedom from pain. Imagine the discussions. The victim's family, if it's a matter of injury or death, would be offered a substantial weregild, a man payment. Remember that from the Viking Age, it persisted in various forms. This amount, negotiated and agreed upon, would satisfy the grievance, buying off the right to vengeance and bringing an end to the dispute, effectively settling the crime outside of physical punishment. For lesser offenses, a direct fine to the Lord or the Church might be levied. The amount would be significant, a heavy burden even for the wealthy, but infinitely preferable to losing a hand or your life. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the pragmatic and sometimes cynical nature of these fines is that even for capital offenses like murder, a wealthy individual could sometimes pay a weregild directly to the victim's family, effectively buying blood money to avert further retaliation or the state's punishment. Imagine your life being worth a specific amount of silver, and if you're wealthy enough, you can just write a check to avoid hanging. Historians still argue whether the Wehrgild system and the prevalence of fines, by providing a non-violent alternative to physical punishment and blood feuds, inadvertently contributed to greater social stability and economic efficiency by preserving skilled labor, or if they primarily served to entrench social inequality, allowing the rich to literally escape justice and perpetuating a two-tiered system where justice was for sale. Did it foster peace or inequality? For the common peasant or artisan, facing the same accusation, the story would be vastly different. Without land, without significant silver, their inability to pay a substantial fine meant they were immediately shunted towards the more brutal physical punishments. A small theft by a poor man might lead to him losing a hand, while a large embezzlement by a wealthy merchant might only result in a hefty fine. The difference wasn't the crime, it was the purse. You see the disparity playing out constantly. The Lord's favor, or the church's willingness to accept a large donation, could also sway the outcome, subtly turning a blind eye to transgressions of the wealthy while relentlessly pursuing the poor. The very infrastructure of justice, the bailiffs, the clerks, the local enforcers, often benefited from this system, further entrenching the power of wealth. The concept of imprisonment as a punishment rather than a holding pen, which we'll discuss later, was rare in the Middle Ages. For the wealthy, if they couldn't pay, exile might be an option. For the poor, it was almost always corporal punishment, designed to leave a lasting physical mark, or death. Your body was the collateral, if your wealth wasn't. You feel the burning injustice, the cold awareness that your fate in the medieval legal system is fundamentally linked to your economic standing. You watch a rich man walk away with a lightened purse but an intact body, knowing that a poorer man would have faced the whip or the gallows for far less. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality, it's about the pervasive, systemic reality of wealthy justice. Your ability to pay a fine or offer Wehrgild often shielded you from the horrifying physical penalties, ensuring that for the vast majority of the population, justice truly sucked, remaining an unequal, arbitrary, and often excruciating ordeal where money literally bought your way out of misery. Even if you lacked the wealth to buy your way out of trouble, and you avoided the terrifying gambles of ordeal and combat, medieval justice still held a grim fate in store for you. Punishments public, brutal. Forget subtle deterrence or rehabilitative measures. The primary goal of medieval penalties was to inflict severe pain, profound humiliation, and often permanent disfigurement, all in full public view, transforming the village square into a stage for terrifying displays of state power. You quickly learn that a transgression isn't just a legal matter, it's a public spectacle designed to brand you, physically and socially, for life, making your very body a living warning to others. It's like being forced to star in a horror movie, but it's real, and the audience is your entire community. You stand in the crowded market square, perhaps forced to watch, or perhaps yourself the unfortunate recipient of justice. The gallows loom in the distance, but for most common offenses, a different kind of horror awaits. The air is thick with the murmur of the crowd, the cries of vendors, and a palpable sense of morbid curiosity mixed with fear. The apparatus of punishment is often simple but chillingly effective. A wooden post, a set of stocks, a whipping post, or a heated iron. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the nature of medieval retribution is that medieval punishments were predominantly public, brutal, and often involved severe corporal harm, mutilation, or public humiliation like the stocks, pillory, or flogging, designed to deter crime, physically mark offenders, and assert social control in a highly visible manner. The goal was less about incarceration and more about immediate, tangible pain and shame. Imagine being led to the stocks or the pillory. For minor offenses like public drunkenness, disturbing the peace, or petty theft, you might find your feet locked in heavy wooden planks, the stocks, or your head and hands clamped into holes on an upright wooden frame, the pillory. You're exposed to the elements, unable to move freely, and utterly at the mercy of the crowd. They might jeer, throw rotten vegetables, or even spit on you. The shame is immense, burning hotter than any physical discomfort. Your reputation, so vital in a close-knit community, is publicly shattered. A particularly quirky tidbit that showcases the ingenuity of public humiliation is the design of specialized shaming devices, or masks. For example, a gossip might be forced to wear a scold's bridle, an iron muzzle clamped onto the head, sometimes with a spiked plate entering the mouth, and then paraded through town. A dishonest baker might be forced to wear a baker's pillory, a heavy wooden collar resembling a pretzel. Imagine being punished by wearing a giant, humiliating hat that literally brands you as a specific kind of offender, making your shame visible to everyone from miles away. Historians still argue whether the primary effectiveness of public humiliation as a punishment lay in its psychological torment, the shame and social ostracism, or if it also served a practical purpose in a pre-literate society by visually communicating the consequences of crime and reinforcing moral norms in an unforgettable way, acting as a living cautionary tale for the masses. Did it break spirits, or just teach lessons? For more serious offenses, or for repeat offenders, corporal punishment became more brutal. Flogging, or whipping, was common. You would be stripped to the waist, perhaps tied to a post, and lashed repeatedly with a whip or a rod. Each blow would tear into your skin, leaving searing welts, the pain agonizing. The cries of the punished man, a common sound in medieval towns, would echo through the square, a chilling reminder of state power. Mutilation was reserved for specific severe crimes, or as a permanent mark for repeat offenders. A thief might have a hand chopped off, a perjurer might have his tongue pierced or cut, and a dishonest merchant might have his ears cropped. These were not just symbolic acts. They were permanent disfigurements that marked the individual for life, making it impossible to hide their past transgression. You might see individuals with missing fingers, scarred faces, or absent ears, living testaments to the unforgiving nature of medieval justice. And then, of course, for the gravest crimes like murder, treason, or heresy, came execution. Hanging was common, a public spectacle designed for deterrence. Burning at the stake awaited heretics or witches. These were not quick, private affairs. They were highly ritualized public ceremonies, often accompanied by sermons from priests, designed to purify the soul of the condemned and instill fear in the populace. You recall the grim duties of the executioner from earlier. His precise blows and manipulations were part of this brutal display. You feel the collective gaze of the crowd, the raw fear that permeates the air, and the chilling realization that your body is merely a canvas upon which justice writes its brutal message. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its inherent unfairness. It's about the shocking, pervasive reality of public, brutal punishments. Your slightest misstep could lead to agonizing pain, profound humiliation, and permanent disfigurement, ensuring that the consequences of crime were etched not just in legal records, but in the very flesh and memory of the community. A constant, horrifying spectacle of state power. Beyond the public spectacle of brutal punishments, medieval justice often descended into an even darker, more terrifying realm. A hidden chamber of suffering designed to break the human spirit. Torture extracting confessions. Forget logical reasoning or compelling evidence. In this era, torture was a legally sanctioned and widely practiced method for forcing a suspect to admit guilt, implicate others, or reveal information, transforming a legal inquiry into an agonizing contest of endurance against excruciating pain. You quickly learned that truth in the Middle Ages could be beaten out of you, and that the silence of the dungeon walls held screams that no one would ever hear. It's like being trapped in a horror movie, but you're the unwilling star, and the goal is to make you confess to anything, whether it's true or not. Under unbearable torment, you find yourself in a dark, damp, subterranean chamber, often within a castle dungeon or a city prison. The air is cold, heavy, and thick with the metallic scent of blood, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the lingering odor of fear. Before you stand various contraptions, grotesque in their design, each meticulously crafted to inflict maximum pain, wooden frames with ropes and rollers, spiked chairs, iron boots, and an array of clamps and screws. Your torturer, often the executioner himself, remember that miserable fellow. His job was tied to this too, moves with chilling efficiency, his face impassive, his movements practiced. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this grim practice is that torture was a widely accepted and legally sanctioned method used by secular and ecclesiastical courts throughout the Middle Ages to extract confessions, obtain testimony, and punish criminals, with a vast array of agonizing instruments designed to inflict extreme physical pain without necessarily causing immediate death. Confessions obtained under torture were often considered legally valid, despite their inherent unreliability. Imagine the condemned, perhaps accused of heresy, treason, or a serious felony, brought before you. They might already be weakened by hunger, fear, and prolonged imprisonment. The magistrate or inquisitor, often a stern-faced cleric or a grim royal official, would be present, taking notes, their eyes fixed on the proceedings, indifferent to the suffering unfolding before them. Their goal is a confession, and your role is to provide it by any means necessary. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the perverse ingenuity of medieval torture is the development of specific devices designed to exploit common human fears or vulnerabilities. For instance, the strappado would hoist a victim by their bound wrists, often with weights tied to their feet, dislocating their shoulders with agonizing slowness. Or the water torture, where a victim was forced to ingest vast quantities of water until their body swelled, or water was poured slowly onto a cloth over their mouth, simulating drowning. Imagine being held over a well, and your only choice is to confess, or drown slowly, inch by agonizing inch. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on torture in medieval justice was primarily a desperate measure born of a lack of sophisticated investigative tools like forensic science, making physical pain the only perceived way to uncover truth, or if it was also a reflection of a societal belief in the inherent efficacy of suffering to cleanse sin and reveal divine judgment, making the confession, however forced, seem a righteous outcome. Was it about uncovering truth or exercising raw, terrifying power? You begin the process, often systematically, starting with less severe pain, perhaps the thumb screws, slowly tightening the vise, crushing the fingers or toes. You listen to the grunts of pain, the strained breaths, watching for the first signs of a breaking will. Then, if no confession is forthcoming, you escalate. The rack is perhaps the most iconic and terrifying of the instruments. You bind the victim's wrists and ankles to rollers at opposite ends of a large wooden frame. Then, slowly, methodically, you turn a crank, stretching their body, tearing muscles and ligaments, dislocating joints with horrifying snaps. The screams are deafening, echoing off the stone walls, a sound you've become grimly accustomed to, but which still grates at the edges of your sanity. You are a precise mechanic of pain, knowing exactly how far to push before the body breaks or the mind shatters. Your grim expertise, gleaned from years of practice, allows you to inflict maximum pain without necessarily causing immediate death. You know which nerves to press, which joints to target, which techniques prolong suffering. This knowledge is your power, but also your curse, as it makes you an unwilling architect of unspeakable human agony. The confession, when it finally comes, is often a desperate cry for release, a willingness to admit to anything just to make the pain stop. Whether it's true or false is secondary to the immediate goal. Once the confession is extracted, the torture usually ceases, but the damage is often permanent broken bones, dislocated limbs, and profound psychological trauma. The victim, now confessed, faces the formal judgment and punishment, their body and spirit irrevocably broken. You feel the cold metal of the instruments, the resistance of flesh under pressure, and the chilling satisfaction, or perhaps grim numbness, of having achieved your objective. The miserable life of a medieval executioner or torturer isn't solely defined by the public spectacles. It delves into the hidden, terrifying depths of human endurance, making you the brutal, unwilling orchestrator of agonizing pain, a constant reminder of the darkness inherent in a justice system that sought truth through torment, and where your hands, more than any other tool, were forever stained by the art of human suffering. The walls of the torture chamber, silent witnesses to countless agonies, hold secrets that no confession, however coerced, could ever truly erase. Even more terrifying than the physical torment of the rack, a pervasive and deeply irrational fear often gripped medieval communities, turning suspicion into deadly accusations, witchcraft trials, superstition's fury. Forget clear evidence or logical reasoning. In this era, a poor harvest, a sick child, or even a sudden storm could be blamed on malevolent magic, turning innocent individuals into targets of mass hysteria and brutal judicial proceedings. You quickly learn that in this world, merely being old, unpopular, or possessing unusual knowledge could lead you to face accusations of consorting with dark forces, and your trial would be a terrifying descent into the absurd, driven by fear and fueled by the cruelest superstitions. It's like being caught in a terrifying play where the script is written by mass paranoia, and you're cast as the villain, with no hope of changing the ending. You find yourself in a village, perhaps your own, where whispers have begun to spread. A cow has fallen ill, a child has a strange fever, or the butter won't churn. Fingers begin to point, subtly at first, then with increasing certainty, towards an individual. It might be an old woman living alone, known for her herbal remedies, or a newcomer to the village, whose unfamiliar ways breed distrust. The air becomes thick with suspicion, fear, and a terrifying blend of religious fervor and folk belief. One mainstream historical fact that completely redefines the concept of fair trial is that witchcraft accusations and trials particularly prevalent from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, were characterized by irrational accusations, reliance on dubious evidence like spectral testimony or physical marks, coercive torture to extract confessions, and often led to public execution, fueled by widespread superstition, religious fervor, and societal anxieties. These trials were a terrifying manifestation of unchecked fear and a profound lack of scientific understanding. Imagine being accused of flying on a broomstick, and your defense is utterly irrelevant to the judge. Imagine the accusation. It might start with a muttered curse, a sudden misfortune, or a strange dream someone had about you. The accusation quickly escalates. Neighbors who once knew you now eye you with terror. The local lord or a church official, perhaps genuinely believing in the power of dark magic, takes up the case. The process often bypasses normal legal procedures, driven by a terrifying urgency to root out evil. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the irrationality of these trials is the use of witch prickers. Individuals, often self-proclaimed experts, who claimed they could find devil's marks on an accused witch's body. These marks were supposedly insensitive to pain and did not bleed when pricked, serving as proof of a pact with the devil. Imagine being stripped naked, prodded, and pricked all over your body by a stranger, with every mark that doesn't bleed being used as evidence against you. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of witchcraft trials in the later Middle Ages and early modern period was primarily a direct result of the Church's intensified campaign against heresy and folk magic, seeking to consolidate its spiritual authority, or if it was more deeply rooted in broader societal anxieties like plague, famine, social unrest that led communities to seek scapegoats and explanations for inexplicable misfortunes, with religious doctrine providing the framework for persecution. Was it theological imperative or societal panic that fueled the fury? The evidence presented against you would be terrifyingly flimsy. Hearsay, rumors, old grudges, and the testimony of frightened or malicious neighbors. A strange look you once gave, a comment you made years ago, a dream a child had, all could be twisted into proof of your malevolent intent. The concept of actual, tangible proof was largely absent. If direct evidence was lacking, torture, remember that brutal reality from the previous section, would be readily employed to extract a confession. The belief was that the devil would give his adherents supernatural strength to resist pain, so only extreme torment could break their resolve and force them to admit their pact with evil. Confessions, however coerced and unreliable, were often the primary goal, leading to agonizing suffering for innocent individuals, desperate to make the pain stop. The fear of witches was pervasive, driven by religious teachings that demonized folk magic and by widespread superstition. Communities genuinely believed that witches could blight crops, sicken livestock, cause illness, and even kill through unseen curses. This collective terror meant that once accused, your fate was often sealed, regardless of your actual innocence. The trials themselves could be public spectacles, drawing large crowds who were both terrified and eager to witness divine justice, or the punishment of perceived evil. The atmosphere would be highly charged, fueled by religious fervor and public hysteria, leaving little room for rational thought or compassion. If found guilty, the punishment was often execution, usually by burning at the stake, especially in areas with strong church influence, to purify the land of the perceived evil and condemn the witch's soul to eternal damnation. You feel the cold fear gripping your heart, the utter helplessness of being caught in a maelstrom of irrationality. You try to protest your innocence, but your words are drowned out by the shouts of the accusers and the grim pronouncements of the judge. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable fury of witchcraft trials. Your very life could be condemned by superstition, by flimsy accusations, and by a pervasive belief in dark magic, turning your trial into a nightmarish descent into irrationality, where fear, not facts, dictated your agonizing fate. Having witnessed the terrifying irrationality of witchcraft accusations and the brutal reality of torture, another profound disadvantage of medieval justice becomes starkly apparent. No lawyer's defenseless accused. Forget the intricate legal arguments, the impassioned defenses, or the clever cross-examinations of modern courtrooms. In the Middle Ages, particularly for the common person, you largely stood alone before your accusers and your judge, utterly unrepresented and ill-equipped to navigate the bewildering legal landscape. You quickly learn that your fate hinges not on the skill of an advocate, but on your own limited ability to speak, plead, and perhaps simply beg for mercy. It's like being forced into a boxing match with one arm tied behind your back, while your opponent has a team of coaches screaming advice. You find yourself standing before the Lord's bailiff, or a church official, accused of a transgression. The accusation might be simple: a stolen chicken, failure to perform a feudal duty, or something far more grave, like a public insult to the Lord, or even murder. The accuser or his representative states their case, perhaps with a clear, practiced voice. Then, the judge turns to you, expecting your response. There's no one by your side, no learned advocate to explain the nuances of local custom, to challenge the evidence, or to guide your testimony. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the concept of a fair trial for the common person is that for most of the Middle Ages, legal representation, as we understand it, a professional lawyer advocating on behalf of an accused individual, was largely absent, particularly in manorial and local courts, leaving common people to defend themselves against accusations, often illiterate and unfamiliar with complex legal procedures or customary laws. Access to legal counsel was a rare privilege, mostly reserved for the wealthy or for very complex ecclesiastical cases. Imagine having to defend yourself against a serious charge without even knowing the proper legal terms or procedures. Imagine trying to understand the proceedings. The language might be a local dialect, or perhaps Latin if you're in a church court, already a barrier for many. The customs are bewildering. The concept of evidence might be vague, relying on rumor, oath-swearing, or divine judgment. Remember those ordeals. You might be intimidated by the stern faces of the Lord's retainers, or by the solemnity of the church. Your own fear and confusion can make it difficult to articulate your defense, to remember details, or to challenge a false accusation effectively. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights this lack of formal representation is the role of friends, or kin, who might speak on your behalf, but only as character witnesses or oath helpers. Remember those from the Viking Age. They persisted here too. They couldn't offer legal advice or cross-examine. Imagine having your best buddy stand up and say, "He's a good bloke, never stole a sheep in his life." And that's the closest you get to a legal defense. Historians still argue whether the absence of professional lawyers in medieval courts inadvertently fostered a more direct and community-focused form of justice, where individuals had to publicly account for themselves and rely on their reputation within the community, or if it primarily led to systemic injustices, making it impossible for the less articulate, the marginalized, or the genuinely innocent to effectively defend themselves against powerful accusers. Did it promote honesty or vulnerability? If you were illiterate, As most common people were, you couldn't read any written accusations against you or understand the legal documents that might be presented. You relied entirely on what was read aloud, and often, what was chosen to be read aloud. This put you at a severe disadvantage against any literate accuser or judicial official. The judge, whether a lord's bailiff or a cleric, was often not impartial. They might have personal biases, be influenced by the accuser's status, or simply be more concerned with a swift resolution than a truly fair one. Without a trained advocate to point out procedural errors, to highlight inconsistencies in testimony, or to argue points of law, you were utterly at their mercy. Even for relatively minor offenses, the lack of a lawyer meant that you might unknowingly incriminate yourself, or fail to present crucial information that could prove your innocence. The legal process, designed by and for the literate elite, was a perilous trap for the uninitiated. Your very words, stumbled or poorly chosen, could become the instrument of your own condemnation. You feel the cold sweat on your brow, the knot of fear in your stomach, as you stammer out your defense, knowing that your words are inadequate, your understanding incomplete. You look to the faces of the onlookers, hoping for some sign of sympathy, but most are grim, silent, or simply curious. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality or its arbitrary nature. It's about the profound defenselessness of the accused. Your legal fate was often determined by a system you couldn't comprehend without the aid of a skilled advocate, ensuring that for the common person, justice truly sucked, leaving you to face your accusers and your brutal punishment utterly alone. Even if you managed to stammer out a defense without the aid of a lawyer, your fate in medieval justice often rested on the judgment of your peers. But a closer look reveals that juries not so peerful were far from the impartial, unbiased bodies you imagine today. Forget a sequestered jury of your true peers deliberating in secret. Medieval juries were often composed of your neighbors, acquaintances, or even feudal dependents, deeply influenced by local politics, social pressures, and outright intimidation, making true impartiality a rare and dangerous luxury. You quickly learn that your guilt or innocence might be decided not by objective facts, but by who your family knows, who your lord favors, and whether anyone in the room is too scared to disagree. It's like being judged by a popularity contest, but the popular kids are also armed and beholden to a powerful local bully. You stand before a group of men, perhaps a dozen or so, chosen from the local community. These are your jurors, but their role is fundamentally different from a modern jury. They are not necessarily there to weigh evidence presented to them. Often, they are already familiar with the case, the accused, and the accuser through local gossip and personal knowledge. Their role might be closer to that of witnesses testifying to the character or general reputation of the parties involved, or simply confirming what is already publicly known. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the function of medieval juries is that early medieval juries, assize juries or compurgators, often functioned more as witnesses who swore to the truth of a party's claim or character, rather than impartial arbiters of evidence, and were highly susceptible to local social pressures, intimidation from powerful lords, and pre-existing community biases, making truly fair and unbiased verdicts rare for common people. The concept of an impartial jury of peers evolved over centuries. Imagine the pressure on these jurors. They are your neighbors, yes, but they also live under the same lord you do. Their livelihoods, their very safety, might depend on not offending the local lord or a powerful family in the community. If a prominent noble or a wealthy landowner is the accuser, or is backing a particular side, the jury might be implicitly, or even explicitly, intimidated into reaching a specific verdict. Their judgment is rarely truly independent. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the informal and community-driven nature of these early juries is the practice of compurgation, or oath swearing, from the Viking section. In this system, the accused would swear an oath of innocence, and then a number of oath helpers, often 11 or 12 like a jury, typically from their own community, would swear that they believed the accused's oath was true. They weren't swearing to facts of the case, but to the accused's credibility and character. Imagine your innocence being proven by simply getting enough friends to swear you're not a liar, rather than by proving you didn't commit the crime. Historians still argue whether the compurgation system, by requiring community support and a good reputation to clear one's name, inadvertently promoted social cohesion and ethical behavior within tight-knit communities, or if it primarily served to entrench existing social hierarchies, making it impossible for the marginalized or those without a strong social network to defend themselves against powerful accusations, regardless of their actual innocence. Did it promote virtue or social leverage? The jury members would be chosen by the lord or his official, not by you. They might include local landholders, respected village elders, or even tenants beholden to the lord. There was no voir dire to select impartial jurors, no process to eliminate bias. You faced a jury that might already know you, know your family's feuds, or owe allegiance to your accuser. Their deliberation was often public, not secret. They might consult among themselves, perhaps in hushed tones, but their decision would be made under the watchful eye of the lord or his bailiff. Dissenting voices might be pressured into conformity. The verdict was then announced, often by a spokesman for the group, a collective decision that represented the truth as determined by the community. For capital crimes, the stakes were incredibly high. A jury's verdict could send you to the gallows or to a brutal ordeal. Their decision was often final, with little opportunity for appeal. You were entirely dependent on their collective judgment, however biased or intimidated it might be. You feel the weight of their silent scrutiny, the uneasy awareness that their judgment is not just about you, but about their own standing within the community. You try to read their faces, hoping for a flicker of sympathy, but most are grim, impassive. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality or its arbitrariness. It's about the inherent bias and vulnerability of its juries. Your fate was often decided not by an impartial examination of facts, but by a system deeply intertwined with local power, social pressure, and the personal relationships within your community, ensuring that true, unbiased justice was a rare and precious commodity, making your trial a constant, terrifying gamble where your peers were anything but. Even if you survived the terrifying ordeal of a biased jury, the notion of going to prison in the Middle Ages held a very different, and often equally horrifying, reality than your modern understanding. Prisons holding, not punishing. Forget long sentences in correctional facilities designed for rehabilitation or even fixed periods of punishment. Medieval jails were overwhelmingly squalid, overcrowded, and temporary holding pens designed merely to contain suspects before trial, or to detain debtors and political prisoners, turning incarceration into a brief, miserable prelude to a far more brutal fate. You quickly learn that being thrown into a medieval prison isn't a sentence in itself. It's just a dirty, disease-ridden waiting room for something far worse. It's like being stuck in a very grim, very smelly, eternally uncomfortable airport lounge, waiting for a flight you really don't want to board. You find yourself shoved into a dark, damp cell, perhaps in the dungeon of a castle, a tower gatehouse, or the cellar of a town hall. The air is cold, heavy, and thick with the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, stale food, and the pervasive odor of damp stone and mildew. There's no window, no light beyond the occasional flicker of a guard's torch or a distant sliver from a high, narrow slit. The sounds are a cacophony of groans, coughs, the scurrying of rats, and the constant drip of water. The primary purpose of medieval imprisonment was not punishment in itself, but rather to hold individuals until they could be tried, interrogated often by torture. Remember that from Section 9, or until a ransom or fine was paid. Sentences of long-term imprisonment as a form of punishment were rare, largely because they were expensive to maintain and offered little public deterrence compared to corporal punishment or execution. Your time here is a temporary, miserable limbo. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the function of medieval prisons is that medieval prisons were primarily temporary holding facilities for suspects awaiting trial, debtors, or political prisoners, rather than places of long-term punishment. They were notoriously unsanitary, overcrowded, and dangerous, with disease, starvation, and exposure being common causes of death for inmates. The concept of using incarceration as a direct penalty for crimes largely developed much later. Think about that you might die in jail, not from your sentence, but simply from being in jail. Imagine the living conditions. Your bed is likely a pile of straw, often infested with fleas, lice, and vermin. The floor is cold, damp earth or rough stone, covered in filth. Sanitation is rudimentary to non-existent. Human waste is often collected in open buckets or simply allowed to accumulate in a corner of the cell. Attracting swarms of flies, remember those from ancient Egypt. The stench is overwhelming, a constant assault on your senses. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the casual neglect and lack of state provision for prisoners is that, for common criminals, food and water were often not provided by the jailer as a right. Instead, prisoners were often reliant on charity from outside or on their families bringing them meager provisions. If you had no family or friends, you could literally starve to death in jail, simply for being too poor to be sustained. Imagine being locked up, and your very survival depends on a random act of kindness from someone outside who tosses a stale crust of bread into your cell. Historians still argue whether the lack of state provision for food and basic care in medieval prisons was primarily a pragmatic reflection of limited state resources and a decentralized administration, pushing the burden onto families, or if it was also a deliberate, punitive measure, designed to increase suffering and coerce confessions from the accused through the threat of starvation. Was it about poverty or purposeful cruelty that made prison so dire? Disease was rampant in these overcrowded, unsanitary cells. Typhus, jail fever, dysentery, and other infectious diseases swept through the prison populations with terrifying speed, often killing more inmates than direct executions. You might see fellow prisoners coughing violently, racked with fever, or suffering from agonizing digestive ailments, knowing that you too are constantly exposed to the same invisible killers. Guards were often cruel and corrupt. They might demand bribes for better treatment, for a scrap of extra food, or for a moment of fresh air. Without money or influence, you are utterly at their mercy. Physical abuse from guards or more hardened prisoners was also a constant threat, adding another layer of terror to your incarceration. The psychological toll is immense. The perpetual darkness, the relentless cold and damp, the constant fear of disease, the sounds of suffering from neighboring cells, and the gnawing uncertainty about your ultimate fate all conspire to break your spirit. You are trapped, waiting, unsure if your next journey will be to the court, the torture chamber, or the gallows. You feel the cold dampness on your skin, the rough straw beneath your body, and the constant gnawing of hunger, even after a meager meal. You hear the scurry of rats in the darkness and the distant, chilling clang of a cell door closing. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about the brutality of its sentences. It's about the miserable, temporary nature of its prisons. Your incarceration isn't a punishment, but a horrifying ordeal in itself. A squalid, crowded, disease-ridden holding pen where survival is a daily struggle. And freedom often leads only to a harsher, more public, and utterly inescapable fate. Even if you manage to survive the squalid torment of a medieval prison, a final, chilling punishment loomed for those deemed beyond the pale of society outlawry living death. Forget confinement. This wasn't imprisonment, but a profound legal banishment, stripping you of all rights, protections, and social standing, forcing you to exist as a legal non-person, a wolf's head, whom anyone could kill without legal consequence. You quickly learn that being cast out of the community isn't just about leaving your home. It's about losing your very humanity, becoming a perpetual fugitive in your own land, condemned to a life worse than death for many. It's like being legally erased from existence, a ghost in a world that can legally kill you with impunity. You hear the solemn, chilling pronouncement at the Lord's court, or perhaps from a royal official you are declared an outlaw. The words resonate with a terrifying finality. Your former lord, your neighbors, even your family, are now legally absolved of any duty or obligation towards you. To aid you, to offer you food or shelter, is to risk becoming an outlaw themselves. You are severed from the very fabric of society, cut adrift into an unforgiving world. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this brutal punishment is that outlawry was one of the most severe forms of medieval punishment, particularly in England, rendering the condemned a caput lupinum, wolf's head, meaning they lost all legal protection and could be killed on sight by anyone, effectively placing them outside the law and social order. It was considered a fate worse than physical execution by many, as it denied them a proper burial and legal remembrance. Imagine the sudden, profound silence that follows the declaration. Your few meager possessions are confiscated. Your land, if you had any, seized. Your name, your reputation, everything that defined you within the community is wiped clean, replaced by the grim label of outlaw. Your kinsmen, who stood by you during the trial if they dared. Remember those biased juries. Now avert their gaze, their faces a mixture of sorrow and grim acceptance. Their loyalty is legally superseded by the law's decree. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the dehumanizing aspect of outlawry is the legal phrase, to bear a wolf's head. This wasn't merely a metaphor. It literally meant you were to be treated like a wild wolf, an animal to be hunted and killed without penalty. Imagine being legally classified as a dangerous beast, fair game for anyone with a weapon, stripped of all your human rights, simply for a legal pronouncement. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of outlawry was to deter crime through extreme social shame and physical danger, making it a terrifying public example, or if it also served a practical function by removing disruptive individuals from the community, in a way that avoided the messy complications and moral dilemmas of state-sanctioned capital punishment, effectively letting the wilderness or opportunistic individuals do the execution. Was it deterrence or convenient disposal that made outlawry so prevalent? You are cast out, forced to flee the familiar confines of your village, the fields you know, the roads you've walked. Every stranger is a potential killer, every isolated dwelling a place of danger. You cannot appeal to any court, for you have no legal standing. You cannot buy food or seek shelter openly, for interacting with you risks legal repercussions for others. Your very existence is now a crime punishable by death, at anyone's hand, without consequence. Survival as an outlaw was an immense, near impossible challenge. You would have to live off the land, foraging for meager sustenance in forests, sheltering in caves or hidden groves, constantly vigilant for bounty hunters, disgruntled locals, or simply anyone seeking to gain favor with the Lord by bringing in an outlaw's head. The harsh medieval winters remember those from the coal miner section. Even without being underground, would be your most relentless enemy. Without the warmth of a hearth or the protection of a proper roof, you would be constantly hungry, perpetually cold, and eternally afraid. Some outlaws, driven by desperation, turned to banditry themselves, preying on travelers or isolated farmsteads, becoming the very criminals they were branded as. Others simply vanished into the vast, untamed wilderness, succumbing to starvation, exposure, illness, or the blades of those who found them. There were stories, of course, of legendary outlaws, figures of awe and dread, who somehow survived for years, but these were the rare, romanticized exceptions, usually operating with the secret sympathy of local populations or in very remote areas. The psychological toll is immense. The profound loneliness, the constant paranoia, the loss of identity, and the gnawing certainty that you are hunted, that your life has no value in the eyes of society. These are burdens that would crush your spirit far more effectively than any physical torture. You are a living death, a ghost walking among the living, forever condemned by the law. You feel the cold wind on your face, the vast, unforgiving landscape stretching before you, and the chilling realization that every step you take as an outlaw is a step further into a nightmare, where the only justice is the unforgiving embrace of the wild. And your only companions are fear and the ghosts of your former life. The awful truth about justice in the Middle Ages isn't just about its brutality or its arbitrary nature. It's about the terrifying finality of outlawry. Your life could be legally extinguished without a single drop of blood being shed by an executioner, condemning you to a miserable, hunted existence, a permanent outcast in your own land, a living testament to why justice truly sucked in the Middle Ages. After enduring the arbitrary power of feudal lords, the terrifying gambles of ordeal and combat, the bewildering unwritten laws, the competing moral authority of the church, the pervasive influence of wealthy justice, the brutal public punishments, the agonizing reality of torture, the irrational fury of witchcraft trials, the defenselessness of the accused, the bias of the juries, the squalid nature of prisons, and the living death of outlawry. You finally emerge from our journey through medieval justice to contemplate its complex and enduring legacy-shifting foundations. The seemingly chaotic and brutal legal systems of the Middle Ages, for all their flaws, were not static. They were a crucible where ancient customs met new ideas, gradually laying the groundwork for many of the legal principles and institutions we recognize today, however imperfectly. You realize that the very concept of justice in your modern world owes a surprising, often uncomfortable debt to these challenging centuries. It's like looking at a rough, unpolished stone and realizing it contains the raw material for a magnificent, enduring monument, built over centuries by countless hands. You reflect on the stark contrasts. The direct, personal justice administered by a lord seems primitive compared to your modern courts. Yet it highlighted the importance of local order and swift resolution, even if arbitrary. The terrifying ordeals and combats, though rooted in superstition, were desperate attempts to find truth where evidence was lacking, a crude precursor to more scientific inquiry. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this evolutionary process is that the fragmented and often brutal medieval justice systems, through their reliance on customary law, local courts, and eventual incorporation of Roman and canon law principles, gradually developed foundational concepts like jury trials, legal precedents, and more centralized judicial authority, which ultimately contributed to the formation of modern Western legal systems. It was a slow, often violent, metamorphosis, but a significant one. Imagine the painstaking process. While early medieval law was primarily oral and customary, remember that legal system unwritten confused. The gradual rediscovery of Roman law, the development of canon law by the Church, remember, clergy's courts, and the increasing power of kings slowly began to introduce elements of written statutes, trained legal professionals, and more formalized procedures. This was a long, often contentious dialogue between tradition and innovation, a particularly quirky tidbit that shows the persistent nature of old ways is how certain forms of medieval justice, like trial by ordeal, often continued in popular belief or informal practice long after they were officially abolished by secular or ecclesiastical authorities, for example. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 effectively condemned many ordeals. Imagine people still believing in the witch's ducking stool long after it was legally discarded, highlighting the deep-seated hold of superstition on justice. Historians still argue whether the transition from ordeal-based and combat-based justice to more evidence-based, even if rudimentary legal systems, was primarily driven by intellectual advancements and a growing skepticism about divine intervention, or if it was more a pragmatic response to the Church's desire for control over legal processes and the state's need for more predictable methods of social control and revenue generation through fines. Was it about reason, or about power, that drove legal reform? The development of common law in England, for instance, was a gradual process of royal judges traveling and applying similar rulings in similar cases, slowly creating a body of precedents that transcended purely local custom. The jury system, though initially far from impartial, remember, juries not so peerful, eventually evolved from witnesses to character into arbiters of fact, a fundamental shift that took centuries. Even the harsh punishments, the public floggings and mutilations, remember, punishments public, brutal, eventually gave way to a greater emphasis on imprisonment, which was largely just a holding pen before, from Section 13. This shift, while still far from humane by modern standards, marked a move towards a more controlled, less public display of state power, and a different understanding of how to manage offenders. The very spectacle of the executioner, remember that miserable life, so central to medieval justice, eventually faded from public view, a testament to changing societal sensibilities. You feel the slow grind of history, the gradual evolution of ideas, as the raw, often terrifying methods of the Middle Ages slowly gave way to more structured, if still imperfect, legal frameworks, the demand for order, for a way to resolve disputes and punish transgressions, remained constant. But the methods evolved, driven by changing social, religious, and political landscapes. The awful truth about why justice sucked in the Middle Ages is a powerful reminder of how far our legal systems have come, and the immense human suffering that paved the way for modern notions of fairness and due process. Their messy, brutal, and often arbitrary justice, however flawed, was a necessary stage in the long, tortuous journey of defining law, morality, and social order, leaving an enduring legacy that, for all its discomfort, laid the crucial foundations for the complex, nuanced legal world you inhabit today, proving that even the most broken systems can contain the seeds of future progress. Now, as the echoes of medieval trials fade and the shadows of feudal courts grow quiet, let the stillness of your room embrace you. The brutal punishments, the arbitrary judgments, and the grim realities of medieval justice are safely in the past, part of a history that now dissolves into the gentle hum of your fan. You've journeyed through a world where justice was a perilous gamble, and now, it's time for you to find your own peaceful rest. Let your mind unwind, your muscles relax, and sink into a deep, undisturbed sleep, far from the chaotic courts of the Middle Ages. End of script. Sweet dreams.